September 27th, 1963. 10:04 a.m. Senate Caucus Room, Russell Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. Joseph Michael Valachi sits at a wooden table facing a semicircle of U.S. senators, 16 television cameras, and approximately 300 spectators packed into galleries designed for half that number. He's 60 years old, wearing a conservative gray suit that doesn't fit quite right, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his voice carrying through microphones to an estimated 22 million Americans watching on live television. Senator John McClellan of Arkansas, chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, leans forward and asks the question that will change everything. Mr. Valachi, are you a member of Cosa Nostra? Valachi doesn't hesitate. Yes, sir. And what is Cosa Nostra? It's the organization, the families, what they call the Mafia, but we call it Cosa Nostra, our thing. In that moment, 10:07 a.m., September 27th, 1963, Joseph Valachi becomes the first member of the American Mafia to publicly acknowledge the organization's existence, to describe its structure in detail, to name names, and explain operations on national television. For 50 years, the Mafia has operated behind a wall of silence called Omertà, the code that says you never cooperate with authorities, never testify against fellow members, never even acknowledge the organization exists. Men have died protecting that code. Entire families have been built on absolute adherence to it. Joseph Valachi is about to spend 5 hours systematically destroying it, brick by brick, name by name, murder by murder. By the time he finishes testifying at 3:17 p.m., he will have exposed the commission, detailed initiation ceremonies, described the 5 New York families, named over 300 made members, and explained the internal structure of an organization that law enforcement has been struggling to prove exists for decades. He'll also sign his own death warrant. Vito Genovese, boss of the Luciano crime family, currently serving 15 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, has already put a $100,000 contract on Valachi's head. Every mobster in America wants him dead. He'll spend the rest of his life in protective custody, isolated from general prison population, knowing that any moment could bring a shank from a hired killer. But right now, at 10:07 a.m. on September 27th, 1963, Joseph Valachi is about to become the most important witness in the history of American organized crime prosecution. Not because he's the highest-ranking defector, he isn't, but because he's willing to do it publicly, on television, in front of the entire country, making denial impossible. The question is why? Why would a lifelong criminal, a soldier who'd sworn blood oaths and committed over 30 murders, violate the most sacred code of the life? The answer isn't simple patriotism or sudden moral awakening. The answer is fear, betrayal, and a mistake in an Atlanta prison that transformed a loyal soldier into the Mafia's worst nightmare. 18 months earlier, June 1962, Joseph Valachi arrived at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in June 1962, serving 15 years for heroin trafficking. He wasn't anyone important in the Mafia hierarchy, just a soldier in Vito Genovese's crime family, a guy who'd made his money through gambling, loan sharking, and eventually the narcotics trade that was flooding New York in the late 1950s. But Valachi had one critical characteristic. He'd been arrested alongside several high-ranking members of the Genovese family, including Vito Genovese himself. The boss and approximately 30 other family members were all serving time in Atlanta, convicted on the same narcotics conspiracy charges that had taken down Valachi. In theory, being incarcerated with your boss and fellow soldiers should have provided protection. The Mafia took care of its own in prison, shared commissary money, maintained communication with families outside, protected each other from rival gangs and prison violence. But something had gone wrong in the 18 months since the convictions. Vito Genovese was paranoid, convinced that someone in his organization had cooperated with federal prosecutors to secure the convictions. The evidence at trial had been too specific, the witness testimony too detailed. Someone had talked, not openly, not in court, but to investigators building their case. Genovese was determined to identify the rat and eliminate him. Joseph Valachi, through a combination of bad luck and worse timing, became Genovese's primary suspect. The reasoning was circumstantial. Valachi had been arrested early in the investigation, had been interrogated extensively, and had received a slightly shorter sentence than others convicted in the same conspiracy. To Genovese's paranoid logic, this suggested cooperation. The reality was different. Valachi hadn't cooperated. His shorter sentence came from a better lawyer and a judge who showed mercy based on Valachi's age and relatively minor role. But perception mattered more than reality, especially when the person perceiving was Vito Genovese, sitting in a federal prison cell with 15 years stretching ahead and absolute conviction that betrayal had put him there. In May 1962, Genovese gave Valachi the kiss of death, walked up to him in the prison yard, kissed him on the cheek in full view of other inmates, and walked away without a word. Every mobster understood what this meant. Valachi was marked for execution. The kiss was Genovese's way of announcing the contract without violating prison communication rules that could add time to his sentence. Valachi panicked. He approached other Genovese family members in Atlanta, protested his innocence, swore he'd never cooperated. Nobody believed him. The boss had made his determination. Arguing was pointless and dangerous. Anyone who defended Valachi might be suspected of being a co-conspirator in whatever betrayal Genovese imagined. For 6 weeks, Valachi lived in terror. Every moment in the yard, every shower, every meal in the cafeteria could be the moment someone stabbed him. Prison shanks were crude but effective. Sharpened pieces of metal, filed down toothbrushes, homemade weapons that could kill in seconds. Valachi slept with one eye open, ate food only after watching others consume it first, avoided situations where he'd be cornered or outnumbered. June 22, 1962. The murder. The breaking point came in the prison yard on June 22, 1962. Valachi saw another inmate, a man he barely knew named John Sopp, approaching from across the yard. To Valachi's paranoid perception, Sopp looked like a hitman moving into position. The way he walked, the way his hand stayed in his pocket, the way he seemed focused on Valachi despite the 100 other inmates in the yard. Valachi grabbed a 2-foot length of iron pipe he'd hidden near the weight equipment. As Sopp got within 10 feet, Valachi charged, swinging the pipe with desperate strength. The first blow caught Sopp in the temple, dropping him instantly. Valachi kept swinging. 6 more blows, 7, 8, until guards pulled him off and Sopp's skull was fractured in multiple places. John Sopp died in the prison hospital 3 hours later. He wasn't a hitman. He wasn't connected to Vito Genovese. He wasn't even involved in organized crime. He was serving time for bank robbery, a completely unrelated offense. He'd been walking across the yard to meet a friend, not to kill Joseph Valachi. But Valachi's paranoia, stoked by Genovese's kiss of death, had transformed an innocent man into a mortal threat. The murder was witnessed by dozens of inmates and guards. There was no defense, no legal justification, no way to avoid prosecution. Valachi was charged with first-degree murder and faced the death penalty if convicted. That's when FBI agents approached him with an offer that would change American law enforcement history. The deal. July to September, 1962. Special Agent James Flynn had been monitoring Valachi since his narcotics conviction, believing the low-level soldier might eventually crack under pressure. The murder of John Sopp created exactly the leverage Flynn needed. Valachi was facing execution, either official through the death penalty, or unofficial, through Mafia contract killers who'd finish what Saap's death interrupted. Flynn's pitch was straightforward. Cooperate fully with federal investigators, testify about Mafia operations, and receive protective custody plus consideration for the murder charge. The government couldn't make the charge disappear. Saap's death was too public. But they could recommend mercy, argue for manslaughter instead of murder, potentially reduce Valachi's exposure from death penalty to additional prison time. Valachi's response revealed his psychological state. They already think I'm a rat. Genovese kissed me. Everyone in the yard saw it. I'm dead either way. Might as well get something for it. This reasoning, that perceived betrayal justified actual betrayal, became Valachi's justification for what followed. Over the next 14 months, he provided federal agents with the most comprehensive inside account of Mafia operations anyone had ever delivered. Not just recent activities, but historical context going back to the 1930s. Not just his own family, but details about all 5 New York families, Chicago, New England, other cities where he'd had contact with organized crime. He described initiation ceremonies, the pricked finger, the burning saint card, the oath of loyalty unto death. He named bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, captains, soldiers. He detailed the commission's structure, explained how disputes were mediated, described the rules governing inter-family cooperation. He provided addresses of social clubs, names of legitimate businesses used for money laundering, specifics about murder contracts and their execution. Most critically, he explained Cosa Nostra, our thing, the term mobsters actually used instead of Mafia, which they considered a derogatory name invented by outsiders. This detail proved invaluable because it gave investigators language to use when approaching other potential cooperators, demonstrating insider knowledge that made denial pointless. By September 1963, federal prosecutors had decided Valachi's testimony was too important to keep secret. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who'd made organized crime prosecution his signature issue, wanted Valachi to testify publicly before Congress. Not in a trial that would limit what he could say and restrict it to specific charges, but in congressional hearings that would educate the American public and provide political support for expanded law enforcement powers. Senator John McClellan's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations scheduled 5 days of hearings, beginning September 27, 1963. Joseph Valachi would be the star witness, the man who'd exposed the Mafia to sunlight for the first time in its American history. September 27, 1963, 10 a.m. to 3:17 p.m. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity by 9:30 a.m. Reporters from every major newspaper and television network. Law enforcement officials from FBI, Treasury, Justice Department. Curious citizens who'd lined up for hours to witness history. The proceedings were broadcast live on all 3 major television networks. Unprecedented coverage for congressional testimony. Valachi entered under heavy guard at 9:58 a.m. He looked nervous but determined, aware that millions were watching, that his words would be dissected by mobsters looking for any detail that could help them identify and kill him. He sat at the witness table, flanked by attorneys and federal agents, facing the senators who would question him for the next 5 hours. Senator McClellan began with foundational questions. Was Valachi a member of Cosa Nostra? Yes. How did one become a member? Through sponsorship by existing members, proof of criminal capability, and formal initiation ceremony. What happened during initiation? The pricked finger, the saint card burning in cupped hands, the oath. May I burn like this saint if I betray the secret of this organization. Then McClellan moved to structure. How was Cosa Nostra organized? Into families, each led by a boss. How many families in New York? 5. Who led them? Valachi named names. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Profaci. What was the commission? The governing body that mediated disputes and set policy for all families. The television cameras captured every word. Valachi spoke in his thick New York accent, using Mafia terminology when appropriate, explaining concepts that had never been publicly described. He drew organizational charts on easels positioned for camera view, showing how authority flowed from boss to underboss to captains to soldiers. Then came the murders. McClellan asked Valachi to describe specific killings he'd witnessed or participated in. Valachi complied, detailing over 30 murders spanning 3 decades. The 1930 murder of Peter Morello. The 1931 killings during the Castellammarese War. Contract hits throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Bodies dumped in the East River, buried in New Jersey, dissolved in acid, or simply left on streets as messages to rivals. He described Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of organized crime in the 1930s and 1940s, specialized killers who took contracts from any family willing to pay. He named members: Albert Anastasia, Abe Reles, Louis Lepka. He explained how hits were coordinated, how victims were lured to specific locations, how killers established alibis while their targets died miles away. The senators, the audience, the millions watching on television heard details that had been rumors and speculation for decades, now confirmed by someone who'd lived inside the organization. The Mafia wasn't a myth created by sensationalist journalists. It was real, structured, ruthless, and had operated for 30 years with near impunity. Around 1 p.m., Valachi described the heroin trade, how narcotics had become the Mafia's most profitable racket, despite official commission bans, how bosses publicly condemned drug dealing while privately taxing profits from soldiers who engaged in it, how the trade generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually, corrupted law enforcement at every level, and destroyed communities across America. He named corrupt police officers, judges, politicians who'd taken bribes. He described the payment structures: monthly envelopes to precinct commanders, annual payoffs to prosecutors, campaign contributions to politicians who'd protect Mafia interests. The corruption wasn't occasional or isolated. It was systematic, institutional, woven into the fabric of city governance. By 2:30 p.m., Valachi was describing the current state of organized crime. The power struggles following Albert Anastasia's 1957 murder. The Appalachian meeting and its disastrous exposure. The increasing federal pressure that had led to the 1959 narcotics convictions. The paranoia consuming Vito Genovese in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The paranoia that had ultimately created the situation leading to Valachi's testimony. Senator McClellan asked why Valachi was cooperating. What motivated breaking Omertà after a lifetime of adherence? Valachi's answer was blunt. Vito Genovese gave me the kiss of death for something I didn't do. He decided I was a rat without proof, without trial, without giving me a chance to defend myself. So I figured, if I'm gonna die as a rat, I might as well be one. At least this way, my family gets protected, and maybe some good comes from it. The honesty was stunning. Valachi wasn't claiming moral transformation or patriotic awakening. He was admitting that self-preservation and revenge against Genovese motivated his cooperation. But that honesty made him credible in ways a sanitized narrative wouldn't have. The questioning ended at 3:17 p.m. Senator McClellan thanked Valachi for his cooperation, acknowledged the risk he'd taken, and recessed the hearing until the following Monday. Valachi stood, surrounded immediately by federal marshals, and was escorted from the hearing room to a secure location where he'd spend the rest of his life. The aftermath. Immediate. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Evening news broadcasts led with Valachi's testimony. Newspapers printed transcripts across multiple pages. Radio shows discussed the revelations throughout the night. The American public, which had viewed the Mafia as either myth or exaggeration, now understood it was real, powerful, and operating in their cities. Law enforcement agencies praised the testimony as vindication of years of investigation. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who'd publicly denied the Mafia's existence until 1957, suddenly claimed credit for exposing it. Robert F. Kennedy called it a watershed moment in the fight against organized crime, promised expanded federal prosecutions, and requested congressional funding for new investigative task forces. The Mafia's reaction was fury. Vito Genovese, watching from Atlanta on the prison's television, reportedly smashed a chair and spent 3 days in solitary confinement for violent behavior. The commission held emergency meetings to assess damage and identify which operations Valachi's testimony had exposed. Hit contracts were issued, not just on Valachi, but on his family members, on anyone associated with him. But the damage was done. Valachi had named 300 made members, provided addresses of social clubs that could be surveilled, described illegal operations that could be investigated, explained the organizational structure that prosecutors could use to build RICO cases decades later. Most importantly, he'd broken the psychological barrier that had protected the Mafia for generations, the belief that Omertà was absolute, that no member would ever testify publicly, that the code of silence was unbreakable. The aftermath. Long-term. Joseph Valachi spent the remaining 8 years of his life in protective custody. He was housed in a special unit at La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas, separated from general population, under constant guard. The $100,000 contract on his life remained active. Genovese never rescinded it, but prison authorities ensured he was unreachable. He died of a heart attack on April 3, 1971, age 68, having never been successfully attacked, despite 8 years of maximum value target status. His family, wife, children, grandchildren, lived under federal protection, relocated with new identities, cut off from their former lives but alive. Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969, 2 years before Valachi, never having rescinded the kiss of death that had started everything. His last words about Valachi, reported by a fellow inmate, were, "He lived too long. Should have been dead in 62. The long-term impact of Valachi's testimony took decades to fully manifest. Immediate prosecutions were limited. Valachi couldn't testify in court without cross-examination that might expose contradictions or undermine his credibility. But his revelations provided the foundation for future investigations. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, used Valachi's descriptions of Mafia organizational structure to define continuing criminal enterprise, the legal concept that allowed prosecutors to charge bosses for crimes committed by their subordinates. The commission trials of the 1980s, which decimated New York's 5 families, relied on investigative techniques and organizational understanding that traced directly to Valachi's testimony. Most importantly, Valachi proved that Omertà was breakable. After 1963, when federal agents approached mobsters with cooperation offers, they could point to Valachi's survival as proof that witness protection worked. The flood of cooperators in the 1980s and 1990s, including high-ranking bosses like Sammy Gravano, followed the path Valachi pioneered. The legacy September 27, 1963, was the day the American Mafia's greatest protection, secrecy, died on live television. Joseph Valachi wasn't the highest-ranking defector, wasn't the most knowledgeable witness, wasn't even the most articulate, but he was the first to do it publicly, destroying the mystique that had allowed organized crime to operate in the shadows. The Senate caucus room where he testified still hosts hearings today. There's no plaque, no memorial, nothing marking the location where 5 hours of testimony changed American law enforcement. But historians and prosecutors understand its significance. This was ground zero for the modern approach to organized crime prosecution, the moment when bringing down the Mafia became politically possible and operationally achievable. The organizational charts Valachi drew on those easels are preserved in the National Archives, faded now, but still legible. The 5 families he named, Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, Lucchese, Colombo, continued operating for decades, but never recovered the invisibility they'd enjoyed before Valachi spoke. Every subsequent prosecution, every RICO case, every cooperating witness built on the foundation he'd established. The Code of Omertà still exists in theory. Made members still take the oath, still burn the saint card, still swear silence unto death. But everyone knows it's hollow now. Everyone knows that facing life in prison or death contracts, men talk. They cooperate. They testify. They trade secrets for protection. Joseph Valachi proved it was possible. Thousands have followed his path. The final question, the question that haunted Valachi's final years, that he discussed in the memoir he wrote but never published, was whether he'd made the right choice. He'd broken the code, saved his own life, destroyed the organization he'd served for 40 years. Was it justified? Was it honorable? Did the ends, surviving, protecting his family, damaging Vito Genovese, justify the means? Valachi's answer, written in 1970, a year before his death. Genovese broke the code first. He condemned me without evidence, kissed me without trial, sentenced me to death for a crime I didn't commit. I broke Omertà, but he broke faith. The code only works when both sides honor it. When your own boss betrays you, the code is already dead. That rationalization, that betrayal justifies counter-betrayal, became the psychological foundation for every mob cooperator who followed. They weren't breaking the code. The code had been broken first by bosses who'd abandoned loyalty, who'd put self-interest above organizational solidarity, who'd turned La Cosa Nostra from our thing into my thing. 5 hours of testimony, 300 names, 50 years of secrecy destroyed. Joseph Valachi, a nobody soldier from the Bronx, accomplished what the FBI, Justice Department, and Senate investigations couldn't achieve in decades. He made the Mafia real to America, made prosecution politically possible, and proved that the code of silence had an expiration date measured in fear. September 27, 1963, at 10:07 a.m., when Joseph Valachi said, "Yes, sir," to Senator McClellan's question about Cosa Nostra membership, the modern era of organized crime prosecution began. Everything that followed, the RICO Act, the commission trials, the wave of cooperators, the eventual dismantling of the 5 families' power, traces back to that moment when one terrified soldier decided survival meant speaking, and 5 hours of television testimony destroyed what 50 years of Omertà had protected.